If you're enjoying this show, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.
Yes, definitely.
Today we are looking at Senate Resolution 7, a document outlining the proposed U.S. budget for the fiscal year 2025 and projections extending all the way to 2034.
Okay.
We've got some great sources to break down what it all means.
Yeah, Senate Resolution 7 is important to understand, but it's not actually a law.
Okay.
Think of it as a detailed framework or a starting point that Congress will use as they create the country's budget.
So it's more of a wish list than a set-in-stone plan.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
This resolution covers proposed amounts for government revenue,
Okay.
which is the money coming in and spending the money going out.
Makes sense.
These figures are broken down year by year,
Okay.
giving us a look at the government's potential financial plan for the next decade.
A 10-year financial forecast.
Yeah,
That's quite a long-range plan.
it is.
What are some of the key figures we should pay attention to?
Well, Senate Resolution 7 proposes a national debt of $36,371,784,000,000
Yeah, okay.
for the fiscal year 2025, with $29,141,533,000,000
Oh, yeah.
of that being debt held by the public.
Okay. Those are some seriously big numbers.
Yes, there.
But this resolution goes beyond just the overall debt figure, right?
Right.
It actually outlines proposed spending for different parts of the government.
It does. It gets very specific,
Okay.
outlining proposed spending for a wide range of areas,
Like what?
from national defense and international affairs to things like education,
Yeah.
transportation, and agriculture. It's
Yeah.
all covered in detail.
I always find it's the specific examples that really make these things come alive. What are some of the standout figures from the resolution?
One that immediately jumps out is the proposed national defense spending for 2025. $933,481,000,000.
That's a significant amount.
It is.
What about some of the other areas?
For international affairs, the proposal is $65,962,000,000 for the same year. It's also interesting to look at the projected revenue for programs like Social Security.
Okay.
The resolution estimates that will bring in $1,303,924,000,000 in 2025.
So it's not just about where the money is going, but also where it's
Right.
expected to come from?
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Now, I understand this resolution also includes some specific instructions for certain House and Senate committees.
It does. Interestingly, it instructs these committees to come up with plans to reduce the deficit by at least $1 billion over the next 10 years.
That sounds like a considerable challenge.
It is.
Which committees are being tasked with finding these savings?
The resolution specifically names the committees on agriculture, education and workforce energy and commerce, natural resources, finance and health education, labor, and pensions.
That's a pretty diverse group of committees.
It is.
It seems like they're really looking to explore a wide range of options for reducing spending.
Yes, they are.
You're right. But it's important to note that the resolution isn't just about cutting spending.
Right.
It also calls for significant increases in certain areas.
Yes.
Potentially adding up to $175 billion to the budget.
Uh-huh.
That's interesting. Where's that additional funding being directed?
The resolution points to a major potential boost for border security and immigration enforcement.
That's certainly a hot-button issue right now.
It is.
It will be fascinating to see how those discussions play out during the budget process.
Yes, it will.
And it's not just Congress and the Senate paying attention to all of this.
Right.
Experts are also watching these developments closely, and they're calling for some changes to how the entire federal budget process works.
They're calling for reforms.
What kind of reforms are they proposing?
Their main goal is to make the annual budget process more predictable and equitable. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts, and experts believe there's room for improvement in how things are currently done.
It sounds like they're aiming for a more efficient and transparent system overall. Okay, so we've got these massive numbers, specific spending proposals, instructions for committees, and calls for reform. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
So what does it all really tell us about the government's priorities
That's a great question.
for the next decade?
Yeah.
How might these budgetary decisions impact different parts of the economy and ultimately people like you?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore in more detail as we continue our look at Senate Resolution 7. It's important to keep in mind that this is just the starting point. Senate Resolution 7 sets the stage, but a lot can change before anything is finalized. Think of it as the opening act, not the grand finale.
So it's really more about signaling intentions and sparking discussion than laying out a fixed plan.
Exactly. Now, I know you enjoy looking at the specifics, so let's dive back into some more details from the resolution.
I'm all ears. What other key figures catch your eye?
We've already discussed national defense spending, but let's look at some other areas. Senate Resolution 7 lays out proposed spending for each major functional category of the government year by year. For example, for general science, space, and technology, the proposed budget for 2025 is $42,084 million.
Space exploration always captures the imagination. It's interesting to see how much they are proposing to allocate to that area.
And then there's energy, with a proposed budget of $39,842 million for the same year. For those interested in environmental issues under natural resources and environment, the proposed spending is $88,219 million for 2025.
That's a pretty substantial figure. It seems to suggest that they're taking environmental concerns seriously. What about agriculture?
Agriculture is allocated $58,457 million for 2025. Considering how crucial agriculture is to the economy, that number makes sense.
And what about transportation? That's an area that affects pretty much everyone's daily life.
For transportation, they're suggesting $173,158 million for 2025. This could be used for a wide range of things, from maintaining roads to improving public transit.
I imagine there are always a lot of competing priorities when it comes to transportation spending. What about social services? How does the resolution address those?
Well, in the category community and regional development, the proposed budget for 2025 is $87,762 million. And for education, training, employment, and social services, they're proposing $149,303 million.
Those are crucial areas, especially during times of economic uncertainty. It seems like many of these budget proposals represent choices about where our resources go and how they can affect communities across the country.
You're absolutely right. These aren't just abstract numbers. They represent real-world decisions with real-world consequences.
Speaking of crucial areas, healthcare is always a topic that's on people's minds. What does the resolution say about that?
For health, the proposed spending for 2025 is $945,070 million. This covers a broad range of health-related programs and initiatives.
And what about Medicare, the health insurance program for seniors? That's a big one, right?
Absolutely. The resolution proposes $950,891 million for Medicare in 2025. Given the aging population, it makes sense that this represents a substantial portion of the overall budget.
It's a reminder that these budget figures reflect broader demographic trends as well.
Exactly. And it's not just health care for seniors that they're addressing. The resolution also proposes $712,446 million for income security in 2025. This category includes various programs that provide financial assistance and support to individuals and families in need.
So they're really trying to address a wide range of needs, from education and healthcare to transportation and support for those struggling financially. It sounds pretty comprehensive.
It does. This document seems to touch on almost every aspect of government spending.
You know, there's one category we haven't mentioned yet, administration of justice. What's the proposed spending for that?
Great point. For administration of justice, the resolution proposes $83,111 million for 2025. This covers law enforcement courts and correctional facilities. And of course, we can't forget about net interest, which is the cost of servicing the national debt.
That's a big one, especially considering the overall debt levels we talked about earlier.
It is. The resolution proposes $1,010,050 million for net interest in 2025. That's a significant chunk of the overall budget and highlights the long-term financial challenges that come with high levels of debt.
It underscores the need for careful financial planning and management. Now, I understand that Senate Resolution 7 goes beyond just numbers. There are also specific instructions for certain committees, right?
You're right. We've already mentioned the deficit reduction targets, but it goes beyond that. There are also sections dedicated to what are called reserve funds.
What are reserve funds exactly? I'm not familiar with that term.
Essentially, these are mechanisms that allow for flexibility in the budget process. For instance, there's a reserve fund for reconciliation legislation. The chairs of the budget committees in both the House and Senate can use this to adjust budget allocations to accommodate the budgetary effects of certain types of legislation.
So it's kind of like a safety valve. to ensure that important legislation could be passed without being held back by strict budget limits.
That's a good way to think about it. There are other reserve funds as well, like the Reserve Fund for Deficit-Neutral Legislation, which allows for adjustments as long as the proposed legislation wouldn't increase the deficit over a specific period. And then there's the Deficit-Neutral Reserve Fund relating to protecting Medicare and Medicaid, which focuses specifically on legislation aimed at safeguarding those programs.
Given the ongoing debates about healthcare affordability and access, that particular reserve fund seems especially relevant right now. What other reserve funds are there?
Lastly, there's the Deficit Neutral Reserve Fund relating to government deregulation. This allows for adjustments related to reducing government regulations as long as the legislation doesn't increase the deficit.
It's interesting how they've built in these mechanisms for flexibility and responsiveness to changing situations.
It speaks to the dynamic nature of the budget process and the importance of planning for the unexpected. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still more to explore.
I'm ready for more. What else should we be paying attention to when it comes to Senate Resolution 7? We've explored the numbers, the categories, the reserve funds. What's the takeaway? What does it all mean?
Looking at the bigger picture, Senate Resolution 7 offers insights into the government's long-term economic vision.
Can you expand on that? What stands out to you as the most important part of this vision?
The proposed increases in defense spending suggest a focus on strengthening national security. This could be in response to perceived global threats or shifts in the geopolitical landscape.
How might those proposed increases translate into tangible changes? What could they mean for people on the ground?
Increased defense spending could lead to several outcomes. We might see the development of new military technologies, expansion of military bases, or even greater involvement in overseas conflicts.
Those are all significant possibilities. Shifting gears a bit, what about the domestic side of things? What does the resolution tell us about the government's priorities there?
The emphasis on border security and immigration enforcement could signal a shift towards stricter immigration policies. This could have a ripple effect on everything from Border Patrol activities to visa applications and processing.
These are issues that are likely to resonate with many listeners. We've also talked about the spending cuts that the resolution calls for. What implications might those have?
That raises an important question about potential trade-offs. If committees are tasked with finding billions in savings, which areas are most likely to be affected? Could it be social programs, education, scientific research? These decisions have the potential to create very real consequences for individuals and communities across the country.
It's a balancing act, for sure. They're looking to reduce the deficit while also trying to address what they see as pressing needs in areas like defense and border security.
We also have to consider the potential impact of these decisions on economic growth. Increasing spending in certain areas like infrastructure or research and development could stimulate the economy. However, cuts to other areas might have the opposite effect.
So this resolution isn't just about crunching numbers and making spreadsheets balance. It's about shaping the economic landscape for years to come.
That's precisely it. And it's important to remember that this is a dynamic process. Public opinion, economic conditions, even global events can influence how these proposals evolve as they make their way through Congress.
It makes you realize that even though these are projections, they have the potential to touch our lives in many ways. It's not just something happening in a far-off government building. It's connected to our everyday lives.
The resolution itself acknowledges the need for ongoing reform of the federal budget process. That's something worth paying attention to as well.
We talked earlier about experts calling for a more predictable and equitable system. What does that mean in practical terms? What could these reforms look like?
It means finding ways to reduce the political gridlock and uncertainty that often characterize the budget process. It means establishing clearer guidelines and priorities to make sure government spending aligns with the nation's long-term goals. The goal is to create a more stable and transparent process overall.
So Senate Resolution 7 is just one piece of a much larger and ongoing story about how we as a nation decide to allocate our resources.
A story that unfolds every year and one that we all have a role in.
Thanks for joining us for this look at Senate Resolution 7.